In this video, I'll briefly define what an observational study is, introduce the hierarchy of evidence, and try to explain why observational studies are needed and why we can't always do an experiment. Now, when I use the word exposure and outcome, which I do a lot, I mean this in the general sense, meaning that designs we will talk about are applicable to all different types of exposures and all different types of outcomes and areas of health. So, for example, an exposure could be a treatment, an environmental or genetic factor, or a socioeconomic or behavioural factor. Likewise, an outcome could be anything from a health outcome to a health-related behavioural change. There are two broad ways of collecting data to answer a research question: by experiment and by observation. In an experiment, such as a randomised controlled trial, we manipulate the exposure or treatment variable to study its effect. In an observational study, there's no manipulation of the exposure or of any other variable. We just observe the natural variation in the population. And observational studies can be listed into several types as listed here. And it's this absence of randomization in an observational study which means that any differences in the outcome between exposure groups could be due to other differences between those that were exposed and those that were unexposed. The exposure groups are thus not comparable, such that any differences in the outcome may be confounded by other factors. So, for example, if we observe that women who work in stressful occupations tend to give birth to babies that are small for gestational age, it's possible that women in high-stress jobs also smoke more and are also older. And it is these variables, called confounders, that explain the higher incidence of small for gestational age births among women from stressful occupations. And this non-comparability of exposure groups, or potential for confounding, means that we can only really report associations rather than causal effects from an observational study. And while there are a few different ways of controlling for confounding in observational studies, either in the design, such as using matching, or in the analysis, such as by restricting to the non-smoking woman in this example, there's still always a problem that there may be unaccounted for or unmeasured confounding, and we call this residual confounding. So we can never be sure that any differences we observe in the outcome between exposure groups is not due to some other unmeasured factor that is different between the groups. So randomization then is a tool for balancing all other sources of variation across groups and hence controlling for it. And it's for this reason that a randomized experiment sits at the top of the pyramid in the hierarchy of evidence when considering medical research. Here, studies most prone to bias and hence a poorer evidence base for attributing causality sit at the bottom of the pyramid. So observational studies form the bulk of the pyramid, which also reflects their larger volume of contribution to the scientific literature. So at the bottom of the pyramid you can see the case series, and that's there because there's no comparison group in this design. So we should also say that this hierarchy is just a convenient rule of thumb and should only be used as a guide. So cohort studies, for instance, are not always better than a really good case control study, and that's something we'll explore. Given that randomized trials sit at the top, we might therefore ask why bother with observational studies, particularly if we're interested in causality. Well, first, experimentation is not always necessary. Consider, for instance, this study from the 1960s, which examined the link between asbestos exposure and mesothelioma, a rare cancer of the lung. It was actually a study of 33 cases, so it was a case series. Nonetheless, out of the 33 cases examined, all except one had reported exposure to the asbestos mines in the northwestern Cape province in South Africa. And out of more than 10,000 tumours examined and recorded in registers covering other areas of South Africa with no asbestos mines, not a single one had a mesothelioma tumour. So when the effect we wish to understand is so large, an observational study is often sufficient to detect a causal relationship. Second, experimentation can be impossible, meaning that actually there's no choice between doing an observational study or doing a randomized controlled trial. So the observational study is not an alternative. So, for example, in the asbestos study, it would be unethical to randomize to a potentially toxic exposure. And some observations cannot be allocated randomly and so may be impossible. For example, if the interest is in the effect of centralisation of service, then how could you randomise a patient to a centralised versus uncentralised service? There are other examples such as the effect of gender or socio-economic position or aspects related to an individual's tolerance and beliefs, for example home birth or hospital birth, all difficult to randomise. Third, it can be inappropriate or impractical to do an experiment. For example, if there's a long latency between the exposure and outcome, such as studying the link between an exposure during pregnancy and a later life disease such as cardiovascular disease. And also rare outcomes don't lend themselves well to experiment. For example, the only way to study side effects from drugs, which may affect only 1 in 10,000 people, is to use mass surveillance observational data. And lastly, when the interest is in generating hypothesis. So say, for example, we're interested in activity as an exposure. This is a multifaceted behaviour. So we might look at sedentary time, time spent in moderate to vigorous physical activity, aerobic activity versus anaerobic, leisure versus occupational activity, active transportation, etc., etc. In a randomised experiment, we can't design such a study to look at so many different domains. Often we can only look at 2 or 3 different groups. An observational study, on the other hand, may allow many different explanatory variables to be explored. So randomised experiments are often designed to answer a single question. When there are many questions, an observational study can be useful. Fourth is a point related to external validity. And by that, we mean generalizability. So trials are often done in highly selected populations due to costs. This may affect the generalizability of the results to other populations. For instance, trials may be just done in a hospital setting or may have a poor recruitment rate and may only be restricted to individuals without other comorbidities or be from a very narrow age range. So hopefully you can see that observational studies have their place despite their potential inferiority compared to randomized experiments.